So earlier today I was with a group of leaders in one of our cohorts. Actually, this one is a missional cohort, and we were talking about how the church moves forward, engaging, reaching the lost in this very difficult season that we all find ourselves in. And someone brought up the story of the invention of digital photography, and there's some lessons from this. So I've done a bit of research, and it turns out that digital photography was invented in 1975 by a guy named Steve Sasson, who worked for Kodak. And I've got a few notes here. So Steve was an engineer there, and at that time Kodak were the leading global brand in photography, and their business was, for those of you who are young and don't know anything about this, at that time the way photography worked was you took photographs on a film, and then it was sent off to be developed or taken to a camera shop, and it's developed, and all the chemicals, very expensive process, and then you got your printed out photographs. And that's how it worked. And Kodak made a lot of money from selling the films and selling the chemicals and the paper and that whole process. So digital photography, when it first appeared, was a big shock to the system for the management. And basically, when he was interviewed about it, that years later by the New York Times, Steve Sasson said that when he took this idea to management at Kodak, they basically said to him, his quote was that they said to him, "Oh, that's cute, but don't tell anyone about it." And I think part of what was going on there with Kodak was that they saw themselves purely as people who were in the business of selling chemicals rather than capturing memories. And so they had a misunderstanding of what their business was and what they were meant to be about. And so what happened was they ignored this. R&D department at Kodak carried on doing digital stuff, and they developed the technology, but management weren't interested. Now, what was interesting was in the early mid-80s, Sony produced the world's first consumer digital camera. And there was, in response to that, there was a famous paper written internally within Kodak, and it said that they reckon within about a decade or so, digital photography would have got to a high enough quality and to a low enough price that it would gradually capture the market and would become the dominant force in the long run. And that proved to be true. And so by the late 1990s, digital photography was on the rise. It overtook traditional film photography, and I think 1999 was the peak year for that kind of shift to take place. And actually 2007 was the peak year for sales of standalone digital cameras, and of course that was the year when the iPhone was released. And so cameras took on a whole new life after that. But Kodak ignored this for so long that they fell behind the curve, they fell behind the opportunity, they dug their heels in, and what happened was they missed the boat, and they missed the massive opportunity that was ahead of them, and they got so wedded to their old practices they couldn't see their way through for the new ones. And by the time they woke up and realized the mess they were in, it was too late. And in 2012, Kodak had to file for bankruptcy protection, and today it exists, but in a very much smaller and reduced company form. And so there's some lessons from the story of Kodak for us today as leaders in the church. So whether you're paid or late, doesn't really matter, but all of us, I assume, watching this are leaders in groups, in church life, in ministry. And so there's a few lessons just 3 lessons I wanted to quickly pull out from that story of Kodak. And the first lesson is this: we need to have a mindset that is open to change. So we need a mindset that is open to change. So Kodak was stuck on selling films and chemicals. They viewed that as what they were about. And so when this new change came along of potential of digital photography, they didn't have an open enough mind to see the possibilities. I think the way that works in churches today is that we've got stuck on certain forms and ways in which church needs to look. And if something comes outside of that, we're not open to it very often. I'm sure you've been around perhaps leadership teams or church boards or elders, and maybe there's someone there who just is utterly resistant to change just because that's not the way we've done it before. And when we come with that sort of mindset, we're going to find ourselves in an awful lot of trouble. As decision makers, we must be open, we must be willing to embrace or at least to consider new ideas and new change. Otherwise, our decision-making processes themselves are going to be broken, and they won't do the job that they're meant to be doing. And so we need to be willing to lay down our personal preferences, our personal desires. We need to to slaughter the sacred cows that feel just too sacred to lay down, and we're willing to open to have a mindset that's open to change. Otherwise, our church is going to be in a lot of trouble. Second thing I want to point out from the story of Kodak is this: we need to learn to adapt to the changing world around us. We must adapt to the changing world around us. So going back to the story of Kodak, what happened with them was that they had an aversion to recognizing the changes that were on the horizon. So imagine this. Imagine if Kodak, instead of resisting digital photography, embraced it as a core part of what they were about as a business. And maybe, perhaps in the early 2000s, they'd partnered with Apple. And that would have meant that perhaps today, every single camera in an iPhone would have been made by Kodak, and they would have been gazillionaires. They missed the opportunity that was there in front of them because the world was changing, but they didn't want to face up to it. For us today, as leaders in the church, our culture is changing. It's changing rapidly. We're going from a Christendom world, a world where the Christian story is the dominant narrative, to a post-Christian world where all sorts of stories are viewed as equally valid. We no longer have, as someone has said, we no longer have home field advantage. And what COVID has done is it's like an accordion. It's had all the air squeezed out of it. It's concertinaed that timeline. So what might have been, when it was like that, perhaps a 5-10 year process, has shrunk down to a 1 year process. And so much change has gone on. So for instance, let me just be specific now. Let's nail this down. I think for a lot of churches, we've become over-dependent upon the Sunday service, the weekend service. Now, don't get me wrong, I think it's fine to do that. There's many benefits that can come from there. But when we're over-dependent upon it, over-reliant upon it, we misunderstand what we should be about. Traditionally, in Christendom, the way churches were assessed for success was by attendance at the weekend, by your buildings, and by the cash offerings. And the way we did church was we said to people, come to us, come to our building at a time and place of our choosing. We're going to provide religious goods and services for you. In a post-Christian culture, the come to us model is not going to work. We have to work out actually how to obey Jesus and go to them. We have to go and make disciples in the world around us. Now, we can definitely do that as the church. We can still do great services on weekends and gather and celebrate and be fueled up and equipped to go. But I think what we're increasingly going to have to recognize is that in order to be effective in going and extending the kingdom, we have to be thinking in terms of a much more missional mandate, of missional communities or microchurches or house churches, whatever you want to call them. So mid-sized groups that are embedded in homes and in workplaces and in parks and in schools and in coffee shops and in businesses, wherever you are, wherever the Lord has called you, with your sports team, at the gym, and you work out how to incarnate the gospel into that specific context. Now, some of you are going to be antsy at this moment and thinking, oh, are we compromising the gospel? To which the answer is an absolute no, that the unchanging message of what Jesus has done for us never changes, but the clothes we present it in have to change. We have to incarnate it afresh into every generation and into every culture. And so we are going through a rapid cultural change. And as COVID has done this, what we're going to find is as we come out of this season, so maybe in 6 months to a year's time, when we look back, it's going to be a new normal. We're not going to suddenly snap back to what we were doing before. Specifically, talking about Sundays, a lot of the really smart people I'm hearing and listening to, they're guessing and reckoning that even when we're fully post-pandemic and everyone's confidence has returned to gather in big spaces, most churches are going to be 20-30% down on their pre-COVID numbers. And I think what that indicates is that whilst there's going to be exceptions that buck that rule, there's going to be others that are far worse off. But what it indicates is that we have to start to think differently. If we put all our weight or the majority of our energy, in most churches it's 70-80% of the resources go into the Sunday service, go into the weekend service. If we put all our energy into that, then we're going to be far less effective in a post-Christian culture. We have to start to think more differently. We have to be people who are willing to adapt to a changing world. The message stays the same, but the form and the shape of what church looks like has to change to fit our missiology as we go into this post-Christian culture. And then the third and final thing I want to say is this: we have to choose to focus on the right things. Focus on the right things. What Kodak got wrong was that they focused on the wrong things. They focused on how many camera films were they selling. They were focused on how many prints were they producing. They were focusing on how many chemicals they were selling to all the little stores around the nation and around the nations. And they had this massive infrastructure built around that. And of course, when the culture shifted, they had this huge infrastructure they didn't know what to do. And that was one of the reasons they went bankrupt, because they kept financing and over-leveraging against it. And there's an obvious parallel to the church today as we went down that path. But I think if we think about focusing on the right things, we as the church, we as leaders, have to focus on the most important thing. And the most important thing is not keeping our building open. The most important thing is not even running our church services. The most important thing is, how are we doing at making disciples of Jesus? How many disciple-making disciples are we making at this particular time? And yes, that includes Sunday services, so don't hear me wrong on that, but it's about more than that. So it's as we go to, I was talking to a guy yesterday who's seeking to reach teenagers in the local skate park. And he knows that as he does that, the way that's going to be assessed is not about how many of those kids start coming to their Sunday service, as welcome as they would be. Instead, he's got to work out what does church need to look like in that environment? What shape does it have to take on to reach skateboarding teenagers and young adults in the skate park? And we all have to be having these conversations more and more deeply. How do we reach people where they are today? How do we copy the example of the early church who once the persecution of Stephen took place, the martyrdom of Stephen took place, the first persecution broke out. For the next 300 years, the church almost never met in large groups beyond what could gather in a home. So for the first 300 years, the church met in extended households of faith, almost universally. So that there's almost no examples of the church breaking that. And that's because they were a persecuted minority in the fringes of society and culture. They had to work out, how do we do church in this environment, in this world where we find ourselves. And we today, we're not persecuted, but we live in a different sort of world. And so we have to work out, how do we go with the gospel? And I think my proposal for us, and many others are saying this obviously, is that, yeah, we'll do Sundays, but we have to put a lot more of our energy into working out, how do we equip people to go and do this in their everyday lives, in their neighborhoods and in their networks of relationships, to bring the good news of Jesus into those environments, to reach their friends and their neighbors and their colleagues and their family in wonderful, creative ways in those specific contexts. So that's a few lessons from the story of Kodak, the mistakes they made. Let's not make the same mistakes again in our unique situations where we find ourselves. And just before I finish, I also wanted to say that I mentioned at the very beginning, this conversation started from a missional cohort that we've been doing, and we're actually in the process of completely stripping that down and reinventing and building back up. So we're going to be launching a missional cohort. It's going to be a year-long process where we're going to be bringing together both the theory of what it means to be missional, because it's important to get the theological and the background understanding so we make the cultural shift. But also alongside it, we're going to interplay it with a lot of the practical tips and ideas and the wherefores of how you live missionally, and how do you create a culture where you are a church of missionaries who go. And so we're going to talk about the practicalities of how you create households on a common mission. What does it look like? How do you do up and out in those spaces? And how do you gather people? How do you reach the lost? And what about the kids? And what about the food? And all those practical things. So it's going to be super practical and also very grounded in scripture and in great missiology. We're going to bring those two elements together. So if you're interested in that, I'm going to post a link to this where you can get some more information, and over the coming weeks we're going to just be advertising that. So if that's something that would be of interest to you and perhaps with your team, then shoot me a note, and we'd love to talk with you about that, see if that'd be helpful for you. But for all of us, whether you're part of that missional cohort or not, let's learn the lessons from this, learn the lessons from Kodak, and be ready to embrace this new season of opportunity that we're going to step into as we come out of COVID.